Okay, welcome everybody. Good morning. Great to have you with us. I hope it hasn't been too challenging for you to join us today, given the storm events that are happening across a big part of the state today. Someone was telling me over 500,000 people without power, which is pretty extraordinary. This is the VLGA Connect live panel with our panel that I'll introduce to you in just a moment from our policy and integrity bodies here in Victoria. I would firstly like to acknowledge on behalf of the VLGA the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and wherever you're in fact joining us from today. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community, pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. And I'd like to note that I'm coming to you from the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects personally to their elders past, present and emerging. Before I introduce the panel, I'd like to introduce the CEO of the VLGA to say a few words of welcome and to acknowledge our sponsor, Catherine Arndt. Good morning.
Good morning, Chris, and thank you for that introduction, and welcome everyone. It's pleasing to see so many of you here with us today, despite that terrible weather event we had last night. I'd like to acknowledge our partners, Justicia Lawyers, who are a supporter of the VLGA Connect live panel series, and today is our last live panel for the year, but we are feverishly working away to plan for many more next year. So looking forward to that. Today, we're actually hearing from the sector's key stakeholders. We have the policy body, Local Government Victoria, or LGV, and two of the key integrity agencies, IBAC and the Local Government Inspectorate, with us. Very important stakeholders who work with the sector to support them, but also have very specific roles in the types of activities that they undertake that relate to the sector. And we'll hear more about that today. So please have a think about those questions that you might have. I'd like to acknowledge Chris also. It's always a pleasure co-hosting these events with him, and also the VLGA President, Councillor Denise Massoud, who is here with us, and also our former President, Councillor Lambros Tapanos. Hi Lambros, nice to see you. And we also have a board member with us, Councillor Grace Lavella, so welcome. And now I'll hand back over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So the topic today is going to be wherever it takes us, really. We're going to have a look back at the last 12 months of the new council term in a new legislative environment, and it just so happens we've had some pretty timely releases of information this week that are of relevance to the sector as well, that we'll touch on no doubt with our panel. So I'd like to introduce to you firstly the Executive Director of Local Government Victoria, who's with us today, Julie Reid. Good morning, Julie. We have Michael Stefanovic, the Chief Municipal Inspector with the Local Government Inspectorate. Hello, Michael.
Good morning.
And we have David Wolf, Deputy Commissioner from IBAC, who's joining us. Hi, David. Welcome. So we're going to make this a roundtable discussion, and as Catherine said, we encourage your comments and your questions as well in the chat. We are recording the session as usual. There's quite a few people who've registered that haven't joined us, and that could very well be because of the technological challenges they might be having this morning. So really important that we do understand it will be recorded and shared with all of those registrants after the fact. I want to start with a pretty broad question for anyone who wants to open the batting from the panel this morning, and that is, we're 1 year on from council elections. What, if anything, strikes you as different in this term of the council? Julie Reid, can I start with you? Because you're off mute.
Yes, and it's got to be COVID, doesn't it? On our lips for the last, 12 months in particular. And, that's made a really big difference, I think, to the sector from what I've noticed. I mean, obviously, a bit of frustration probably from the sector that you haven't been able to get in there face to face with the community and do that real engagement that you wanted to do. But instead, we've gone online and, we've done the best we can in that respect, using that sort of, I suppose, technology that we haven't had to rely on in the past, and also moving to that virtual environment for council meetings, which has been a big pivot and change. And then now potentially going to this, hybrid situation that you might find yourselves in. So they're obviously really key. Look, I think that what we've noticed is, well, first of all, we were really pleased with the amount or the high percentage of female elected councillors that got through the last election, 43.8%. Which was up from 37.3%, which is fantastic. We've got a target now to reach 50%. So obviously that was a nice surprise and a big change after a different approach towards the election. So that's something that we've noticed that's changed. I think also too, I mean, there's a bit of a, we obviously introduced mandatory training. There was sort of, I think maybe a little bit more confidence maybe we're seeing with councillors in their roles going forward. But as you know, Chris, we've also had issues, culture issues, and we don't know whether that's linked to that online environment where people haven't been able to build relationships as well through the online environment. But we do have some challenges in that culture space, which that we're trying to tackle at the moment. So that they're just some of the observations really from me in the last 12 months.
That was going to be one of my follow-up questions, whether that online space is, in and of itself, it's a solution, obviously, to dealing with what we've had to deal with, but does it also present particular challenges? And I wonder whether Michael or David might like to comment on whether that's been an element in the sorts of issues that have been coming across their desk this year. Michael.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'll jump in there. Many of you probably have seen our elections report that we issued a few months ago, where we sort of addressed that. And the title of that was Social Media Fuels Rising Complaints During the 2020 Council Elections. Now, Julie's explained for all sorts of practical reasons, we've had to shift to the online environment. Campaigning shifted to the online environment. A lot of interaction between councillors and council staff and the community is also now online. And unlike the past, it doesn't go away. You put something online, it's there forever. So in the past, as a ratepayer, I used to, when at election time, I would see the flyers appear in my letterbox, and there'd be some and I'd meet people down at the railway station or wherever else they were trying to campaign. Nowadays, I certainly got the letter in the letterbox, but social media was a factor. And in the olden days, when the election was over, then the sort of everyone just got down to business, and they were meeting in council chambers over the coffee urn and cookies, and things would be sorted out. And if you disagree with what someone said in chambers, then you had the opportunity to deal with it. Now it's the only opportunity appears to be online, and it just stays there. So something that might have been a little disagreement that ordinarily would be resolved now festers, and people who are supporters of one party or the other, or real, imagined or created, also pile on. And the next thing you know, you've something that should have been a fairly simple interpersonal thing that would have been resolved, like I said, over a cup of tea, is now takes on a character all of its own and just doesn't go away. So we see it, we get complaints that come through now. It's essentially, the campaigning is kind of going on, continuing. 12 months in, the campaign continues, and sort of the vindictiveness, in some places continues, and it's been very difficult for some of the elected councillors who've been through that and hope to move on and hope to settle. It has, I've only been in the role for 6 months. It has settled, I would say, in the last few months, which is good. So we'll see what the future brings, and as Julie referred, the culture project that the Minister has commissioned, I think, will probably help us in that regard as well. But that's one of the key things, I think, is just it's made our lives just so much more awkward and permanent, and we need to find ways to sort of step things back and let people have disagreements, but not lasting things that drag back council.
Michael, I'm seeing a lot of nodding as you were making those comments. I think that's resonating with people, and it's already starting to manifest in some comments and questions in the chat, which is great, which we'll come to. David, some introductory thoughts from you on whether the last 12 months has been different for you in the environment that you're dealing with.
From my perspective, I think the last 12 months have been very similar to other council cycles. The first 12 months of councillors getting to know each other, starting to set the direction of council. There's been some new challenges, of course, with COVID and operating in a different environment, but I think the challenges have been, and certainly the feeling's been much the same as many other council terms. What we are seeing is perhaps it's taking a little bit longer to form those connections, as Julie said. We're seeing still a bit of uncertainty around what the legislation means, particularly around those conflict of interest provisions and how decisions are being made. So that's still being tested with us in terms of complaints. There's a bit of unsurety about whether it fits in our remit or it's a matter that can be resolved at perhaps a council level. So that's taking a little bit more time to settle down. Of course, the new legislation's an added layer on top of that as well. But I would say it feels to me very similar to other council cycles, and now councils are getting into the real work of their term, getting to that that second year, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over this 12 months.
David, you mentioned the new legislation. I'm wondering what lessons or observations the panel has from the first year of a council term under the new legislation.
Yeah, look, it's interesting, Chris, because we've had lots of discussions around the table with local government about the challenges faced in getting everything completed within the times that have set. And I suppose that the difficulty that we've found that has made it harder for the councils is that there's no discretion under the Act that allows the minister to be able to extend any of the timeframes for all of the different pieces of work that need to be finished, say, particularly by the end of this year. We were able to give a couple of months extension to the annual report because that was still sitting in the old Act. But there's less discretion for the minister now to extend that. But look, what we've tried to do is say to, particularly to CEOs, do what you can for now, do the minimum requirement, and you can build over time and you can improve over time those documents. We've tried to provide as much support as possible. We've had various working groups working with councils to try and get some sort of, I suppose, common threads with some of those documents that need to be produced. So we hope that has helped in some way. But I think the COVID layer again has just made everything so complex and so busy for councils. We really understand that, and I don't think there was ever an intention or we never thought that we were going to be in this situation when the legislation was drafted up, that we're going to have that extra layer of complexity with a pandemic. So look, we've really felt for councils during this time. We've tried to provide as much support as possible. We are encouraging councils to reach out and to share information between each other. And I know there's some really good working groups on workforce plans and on procurement policies, for example. So I think if they continue to work together and share those good ideas that are coming forward in regions or in whatever groups they want with our support, hopefully we'll get across the line where it's looking pretty hopeful. There's been an enormous amount of work by the sector. And, I know that we at LGV and the Minister is very pleased with the progress on all of that.
Thank you. Noting those comments about timelines, etc., they're fixed, and perhaps the answer is more collaboration across the sector to meet them. I wonder if I might come to Michael about the approach you're taking at the Inspectorate to those requirements. Aside from the report you've released this week on interest returns, which we'll come to, what is the Inspectorate's view, I guess, of monitoring how the new legislative requirements are being met by the sector?
We've just in the last week, I've had, of course, to talk with Julie about exactly that. So it is difficult for everyone. It's difficult for us. So I fully appreciate where councils sit with this. We're learning the new Act, and we're learning the timelines, and we're learning what are we meant to do in terms of enforcing some of it. The approach I've got is that we're not there with a big stick. It's really about trying to bring everyone into compliance. And around Julie's point about the limitations that there are in terms of getting extensions, I'm fully supportive of the idea that we are bound by the Act. So if there are timelines there that you prepare, some form of a document, it may not necessarily be as expansive as you would have liked, but get something in that covers the bases and complies with the Act, and adjust it with the advice of your peers from across the sector and from LGV as you go forward. So I think it's I don't think there's an expectation at this stage of implementation that it's going to be perfect. I think it's a case of everyone's sort of working to see that everyone's looking across, from the conversations I've had with CEOs certainly, everyone's looking across borders to see what someone else has got, to see if they've got a policy that they can use. And I think that's probably the way to go. If you're finding it's difficult at the stage to comply, look at what a neighbour's got that's got similar issues and adopt that. And then, but just knowing for yourself and your community that it's a work in progress. You'll continue to revise it and update it to make it better.
This might be a bit of a provocative comment, but a theme that I've picked up across the sector in various conversations this year is that the principles-based approach of the new Act means that there's a certain amount of leeway at each council as to how you adopt and embrace those principles. The downside, if I can call it that, is that there's no one-size-fits-all template, and it seems for the various pieces of policy information that councils need to produce. And it seems the sector's been looking for that because that's been the way it's worked in the past. I wonder, Julie, is that a theme that you've picked up on? And what do we do about that as a sector?
Yeah, it's been interesting actually, because, you know, we all, often, and I was guilty of this when I was a CEO and when I worked in council, you know, every council is unique. You know, we all think we're unique and we all think we're special and we all think that we, you know, need to have our own sort of approach towards things to a certain degree, I think. So it's been a really interesting approach from the sector where councils have sort of said, well, yeah, okay, well, we want the flexibility and we want the opportunities for innovation, and not necessarily not everybody wants a one size fits all. So this enables that. This enables that sort of ability for those councils who might be a bit more innovative or might be wanting to try different things to be able to do that. But there are, you know, councils that are sort of saying, well, look, we just want the template. Can you just give us the template and then we can just get it done and dusted? And I think I do recognise that maybe that tends to fall more with those councils that have less resources. You know, we know that some councils are, you know, lacking staff with specialties in certain areas, and probably the rural councils have been those ones that have been mostly or most severely hit by this. But what we've done is tried to, as I say, get them to work with their counterparts. And I've seen some really good examples of where rural councils have reached out to metro councils and to sort of, you know, to work with them on different things that might have been able to, you know, sort of almost like not quite sharing resources, but sort of learning from those metro councils that might have more resources in that space to be able to develop up things. I think that there's an ability for councils to have higher degrees of compliance then with their policies because they're shaping them up themselves. So no coming to the minister to say, or to the inspectorate to say, oh, sorry, I've breached that policy, or coming to the minister to say, can you provide us an exemption, you know, which is a really time hungry process that has had to be gone through in the past. So we're trying to streamline it through this way that the legislation is set up, and you have that flexibility to set up your own policies, and procurement is probably a very good example of that. So I think it also encourages councils to focus on those risks and look at cost benefit analysis and things like that as well, and at their own administrative practices. So I can understand the challenges on one hand, and we've tried to group people together and have working groups, as I said, to be able to help support those councils, but it's also an opportunity as well. So I think we just need to I think the sector has had to move or shift in its thinking around the principles-based act. It is a big change. I recognise that.
David, perhaps a leading question. Are you seeing any impacts, I guess, or hidden effects of a lack of, for want of a better word, consistency across policies in the work that you're doing?
Terrific question, Chris. And I was just thinking that as Julie was speaking. I mean, one of the challenges and perhaps one of the things that regulators or corruption commissions don't like is inconsistency with policy or process across the sector when the same function's being delivered across multiple organisations in the same sector. that's really challenging for us, and that's borne out in a number of things that we're looking at, particularly in the planning space, and how particular councils treat planning matters that they want to come in and be decided by council laws as opposed to under delegations. That's an issue for us that we're looking at out of Operation Sand on the Casey Council matter. And we've got some views on that as well. You think about the life cycle of legislation, there'll be principle-based enabling legislation that over time there'll be some problems. Over time the government will then prescribe things to fix the problems. Then we'll get to where we got to with the 89 Act, where it was so schizophrenic in how it was read that you have to go back and rewrite the legislation. So we're at the start of that cycle again, and I think there'll be some reforms out of some issues that are occurring to try and get that consistency across the state.
Okay, let me throw a couple of other things that have come from the new legislation to see whether you've noticed any impact in the first 12 months. Changes to the powers that mayors have, or the responsibilities that mayors have they presented in any way as yet?
I think there's definitely an adaptation there for mayors. I'm not too sure. It'd be interesting to hear from some of the mayors that are on the line today, those that are experienced mayors that have been mayors before under the old legislation and now under the new legislation, whether it's actually shifted for them. And also to hear from those new mayors, there's quite a few councils that have come in that are mayors for the first time as well, and how they're dealing with the powers that they find that they have now, even though they weren't a mayor previously. But look, I think that generally across the board, there's a lot of really, really good mayors that are actually responding really well to the expanded leadership role. But it's not without its challenges. We know that the behaviour stuff is the really challenging stuff that's happening around the table, and but it's one of those things where, like I said, there'll be differing approaches from different mayors around how they deal with that. I think just an example of what happened recently, which I thought was a good example maybe to share with you, is a challenge that was managed really well by the mayor and the CEO at Strathbogie. I don't know whether there's anybody on the line from Strathbogie here today, but the mayor and the CEO actually identified they had predominantly all new councillors that were elected up at Strathbogie, with the exception of the mayor. And really what was happening in that circumstance was the councillors were, I think the mayor and the CEO were of the view that the councillors were struggling with understanding their roles. And so they did a fair amount of work in trying to unpack what they needed. And at the end of the day, they requested the minister to appoint a municipal monitor for a short period of time to help in that education space. So that's been a new space that we've walked into more recently. In the past, it's always been a monitor has come in off the back of the breakdown of governance. This was a slightly different approach, and we're trying that at the moment to see how that works. And this was before we had a breakdown of governance. It's more or less just giving that extra steer and support for the council to make sure that they understood their roles, and has given some support to the mayor. So that was an interesting approach that I thought I'd share with you. You may or may not know about that. But, great leadership from that mayor in trying to find some solutions to help them through what was quite a difficult transition time for them.
What does that tell us about the mandatory training for candidates, Julie, if anything? Perhaps it hasn't gone far enough yet to properly equip new councillors for the role? Yeah,
I mean, it's pretty clear that, we've got lots of really clear modules on code of conduct and confidentiality and conflicts of interest and everything in there. However, I think part of our commitment is to make sure that we continuously improve in that space. And what we did actually was we did a bit of a survey following the last election, and we made some changes to the training modules as a result of the results of that survey. And what we've been able to do is change the training for in advance of the South Gippsland election. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not we get a slightly better result as a result of that. I don't know yet, but we've used that as a bit of a test case to see whether or not any improvements would make a difference. But I do think that, you know, in terms of council decision-making processes, probably the time requirements for the councillor role, I think there's still a bit of I think people coming into those roles are not quite aware of the time commitment and the role of the integrity agencies, and also probably the interaction protocols with staff. I think that there may be 4 of the areas that we think that maybe, you know, we need to kind of sort of continuously have a look at.
I'll just check whether Michael or David have any comments on the mayoral powers or the mandatory training before we move on. Not from David. Michael, any thoughts?
Just with respect, not on the mayoral powers, but just with respect to the mandatory training, I think it's great, and we've actually discussed that in our interest returns report as well, about perhaps some refresher training as well for various aspects, because I think training is all important, and we keep hearing that as a need from across the sector.
So one of the things we wanted to try and help today was sort of define or delineate where your different agencies come in and where you don't, because I think there's still a bit of confusion. I wonder if a way to do this might be to ask you, what sort of impact do you think your agency has had on the sector this year?
I mean, we work really closely with the sector, and one thing that I found in this virtual environment, the benefit is that we've got much better connection, I think, across the whole of the state, because, you know, we don't have to travel anymore, we can connect virtually. And so we've been having regular forums with the CEOs, not only in the emergency COVID space, but also in the strategic space. And I think that this has really helped us I suppose, bring to the table not only a better understanding of the role of LGV, but also how we can help connect councils to other departments across government, and how we work with those other departments to make sure that local government has a voice at the table. So for us, it's really interesting, because often people will come to us about non-compliance with the Act, and I have to say, you need to give Michael a call about that one, because we don't have the powers that Michael has, and I think this is where people think that we do have the powers to take action, and we don't actually have the powers. We are, you know, as you said, we've got a policy branch, we've got a legislative branch that develops legislation or reviews legislation. We provide grants to local government. We deal with a lot of correspondence. We have thousands of letters that come through to our branch every year that are written to the minister or myself about local council issues. And we support the minister, obviously, really importantly, we support the minister in having meetings with all of you and keeping him up to date with what's going on across the sector. So they're the kinds of key roles, I suppose, that we play, and we're certainly not an enforcement body. We're certainly an enabler, and we create those connections and those opportunities for local government. We make sure local government are not forgotten about at the table, and but the best bit of the job is giving you all funding, and you know that there's been a considerable amount of funding that's come through, particularly in the last 12 months. So that's we're all the time seeking sort of opportunities to be able to support local government, whether it be through, you know, financial sustainability or better regulation or improved policy or connections to those parts of government that are going through lots of reform, which seems to be a bit of a trend at the moment. Thanks, Chris.
I think that's a really useful description, Julie, and I saw some people nodding and taking some notes, I think, as you were explaining that. So I want to come to Michael. In terms of your agency, it's very much at the enforcement or monitoring phase. Can you talk a bit about, and I guess it's a good time to talk about the report you've brought out this week. How would you describe the impact your agency's had on the sector this year?
Before I get to that report, I'll just say that I think we've actually probably the biggest thing that I've seen that we've achieved up until this report was we've given people a voice. I think with our report on the elections, I think the candidates and elected councillors, I think it's in our report we've sort of we provided some sort of demonstrable examples of some of the difficulties that the candidates and elected councillors have experienced. I think that's assisted the minister in developing the culture project, and I think again for the investigative body, I think no, it's not how many scalps have we achieved this month. It's about giving that voice and making sure that people have that. And I think we need to learn more from that for ourselves as well. What do we do? Like you said, do we need to then apply ourselves in different areas to look and learn from that? With respect to the interest returns report, I think that is something that I would say now is going to be helpful for across the sector. I think it helps people to focus in on those sort of governance measures that help you to avoid being pulled up before Mr. Wolf and IBAC. And it's amazing how just a bit of transparency around your personal interests can make a world of difference in terms of corruption prevention, misconduct prevention, fraud prevention, all sorts of ways, simply by having it being transparent. Now, like I think everyone's learning how to deal with interest returns at the moment. It's changed from the old Act to a new Act with slightly different requirements. I'll just quickly run through what we've done. Now, the report was only issued several days ago. Now, it was quite a major piece of work. It started nearly a year before I arrived there, and it looked at sort of a high-level review of personal interest returns for 61 councils, and then a sort of an in-depth review of 17 councils. They were selected through random means, and the work that the investigators did, they went through and looked at obviously the returns. They looked at all the councillors. They did internet searches, they did titles checks, business register searches on all of these councillors. And just to give you some sense of the numbers that were involved, they looked at somewhere in the order of 650 councillors and 4,600 returns. So it's quite a significant volume of material. And we certainly identified that there were 51% of cases where councillors had not totally complied with their requirements there. And often it was just a one-off non-disclosure of something, but sometimes it was much more than that. Sometimes it might have been many during the 4 years that we looked at from 2016 to 2020. It may have been total non-compliance, or near enough so the multiple returns were just not completed accurately. And the sort of the key things we discovered was that people failed to disclose beneficial interest, failed to disclose land interests, failed to disclose trust interests. As a result of this review, and it was done from a compliance perspective, but obviously we detected some cases there where there were potentially offences. So we had 7 councillors were interviewed, 35 councillors received a warning, 85 received a letter reminding them to sort of bring themselves into compliance, and we've got one case that that I'm considering for prosecution as well. So it's but the thing that really sort of struck me is that again, case there's the new person on the block, was that the why, and we got to see some of the individual responses from councillors, and overwhelmingly councillors the people that we engaged with were screaming out for guidance as to show me one and I'll do it. Or there was a thing, again, we're all now internet savvy. There was one of the common things that came out was could you please make it an internet form that we can go in and complete, and we don't have to keep re-entering the same information every 6 months. It's something that could be updated on a rolling basis. And that was something we received tremendous feedback on. And just the nature of it being more prescriptive, so that it should be, there should be some sort of a schedule that specifies what it is that's required, that it's in a standard form, and just to remove that sort of element of doubt. Now, another part of what we did, it was only done very late in the piece, but we looked at the personal interest summaries that were being filed online by councils, which is a new requirement to increase transparency. Now, in our report, we saw a wide divergence, hundreds of cases, hundreds of returns in one instance, and considerably less on the other side. Now, we also learned, and this is something for us to take on board, my office, that there's problem because the Act doesn't specify when those returns are supposed to be filed or posted online. There's no that when we went in and had a look, it put us in a situation where we weren't sure. Was it because the council, the CEO and the governance office, was it because they hadn't complied with posting it, that there was nothing there, or that the numbers were low, or was it simply that it was a work in progress or that there was some other reason why the numbers were one way or the other? And I think what we've seen since in the last 2 days, we've received feedback that some of the numbers we looked at, we reported on, were probably wrong, and that's because of where the dates sat as to when we did the review and when the things were posted. So if you look on council websites now, you'll see that the numbers are different. There are returns, or the summaries are posted, and they might be sizable, and that's different from what our report shows, because we conducted it prior to September, which is, as you know, there's a September period for reflecting the returns. So so we've learned too, that unfortunately we should have gone back and sort of double checked as well about, okay, is it just a case of we chose our sample at the wrong side of a date line, and we'll learn from that. And I think we don't want this report to be seen as a big stick on anyone. It's simply, these are the issues. We're now 12 months into a new regime. Declaring these interests is really important for the reasons I've described, with corruption prevention and the like, and transparency. And it's working to make sure that we can come up with some measures to assist the councillors, council staff, and the CEO to comply. Now, we've made some recommendations in there. A number are aimed in Julie's direction. Sorry about that, Julie. But it's around the issue of, what we said about education and guidance and things like that.
Yeah, and that's where, Chris, if I can jump in there, that's where Michael and I would intersect, where we're talking about education. Like we're one of the things that we're driving and trying to make sure is that we have good governance across local government, and that local government as a sector is seen in a really positive light, because there's a lot of great stuff that local government does. So what Michael and I would now work together on is, how do we work together to help educate about what the expectations are across this kind of issue. So that's where we would start to become involved, I suppose, post a report like what Michael's put out.
It's almost, because the numbers are so staggering in terms of non-compliance, clearly we don't have 50% of councillors who are willfully ignoring the requirements. They want to do the right thing. So this is really a screaming out for more guidance and assistance, isn't it, Michael? Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases it is. I think, overwhelmingly councillors want to do the right thing, and they just said, look, please just show me one and I'll do it, and just keep it in the same form. But again, it's quite an onerous thing to do, once you do it once, but then to have to repeat it again in 6 months' time, and you have to start again, as opposed to having a sort of something you can go in and update online. That was something that was continuously put back to us. I'm happy to do it, but it's a lot of effort for me. This is not my main, job in the world, and it can be quite onerous to do these things. So if we can find simpler methods for them to do it, then I'm sure the compliance rate will skyrocket.
David, I'm not sure if you want to comment on that in particular, but it occurs to me that, getting this stuff right, given what we're seeing in the media as we speak, actually, around interests and campaign donation returns, I know is one that you've looked at in the past. That must be the stuff that keeps you awake at night in terms of what's going to come across your radar.
firstly, it's an extraordinary report that Michael and the team have put together. So congratulations on that, Michael. It's important from a couple of perspectives. Firstly, there's the general compliance that's been an issue with interest returns over a long period of time. So that's an opportunity to look at the processes, the timeframes, whether there's some prescriptive elements that need tweaking. So it's important that for that perspective. But the most important issue for us is the non-compliance in relation to the declaration of interest, and, land holdings, business interests, etc., interest in the municipality. And if you think about Operation Sandon, so the Casey Council matter, you've got councillors there. The evidence shows that they had interests with developers or particular parties that had provided donations or gifts. They had business interests which weren't declared, and then they were attending or deciding on matters that came before councils that involved those same people. So the non-compliance in emissions off the interest returns for us is a really, really important element of the process, of the compliance process. Yeah, so really important piece of work, and yes, you're right, that's the sort of issues that we're really concentrating on. If I just go back to the original question, Chris, about our role and the delineation, so Julie and Michael's summary were terrific. Our role is around the corruption elements and the prevention or exposure and the prevention of corruption across the public sector, including local government. Our interaction with local government is probably less frequent than the other two agencies, albeit that we do have a role in assessing complaints related to councillors under the Public Interest Disclosure Act. So we see a lot of those. And we also receive the mandatory reports required of the principal officers, so the CEOs, in relation to suspected corrupt conduct within the council. So that's probably our two most frequent touch points. Where the sector sees us is our exposure function. So that will be primarily through, right now, through our, you'll note we've got some public examinations on at the moment. And that, the one at the moment, Operation Watts, does have some touch points into local government, primarily around the party factional work that has tentacles into local government and also into the grants program. And that's a whole different topic, which I'll perhaps go into on another day, but there'll be some interesting findings coming out of that. And then we also expose corrupt conduct through our publications, and that's where, like Michael has recently done, our work is quite detailed and will focus in on particular actions. And I think the most recent one relating to local government was the one we spoke about earlier this year, Chris, was the perceptions of corruption in local government. We spoke about that report and the benefits that can provide for each of the councils in terms of looking at the risks that their own internal staff are identifying, matching up with your own internal risk registers and addressing some of those key concerns.
I want to move into audience Q&A before we run out of time. But David, while I've got you, you've answered my question about Operation Watts. I was going to ask you about the touch points with local government there. You've also brought out, IBAC's brought out a report this week from Operation Turon, which has got a bit of a tenuous link in terms of the findings about social media policies. And I wonder if you want to comment on what local government employees and councillors should be looking at in that case.
Yes, indeed. So for those that aren't aware, it was a case relating to a very senior Victoria Police employee who set up a social media account under an assumed identity for the purpose of, and he actually said this in his evidence, he felt like he didn't have a platform to fight back against some of the social media criticism that his organisation was receiving. So he did exactly what he was complaining about. He set up a fake social media account to then disparage other people. Aside from the outcomes of that investigation, what it really did draw out was the policy vacuum at the time in terms of how employees were expected to behave and the rules around it. And we were talking earlier that policy formation is not the most exciting part of work of any organisation. The development, adoption, and then socialisation of policy documentation is challenging. But when something goes wrong, it's the very first thing that either the organisation or an agency like ours will go to. So it's important that for a risk area like this, and social media has already been spoken about previously in this forum, it's still emerging and growing as a risk area for employees and councillors. So having a robust policy that takes into account change in dynamics, different platforms that are being used, and making sure that the organisation's on top of that risk, setting the ground rules for employees to try and mitigate it as far as possible, but primarily setting the expectations around what employees can and can't do, particularly if they're commenting on or about council business.
Or using information perhaps in a way that it's not intended, that the implications on culture that comes from that, David.
So in effect, the actions you take to pursue your own particular views have that alternative effect of damaging the reputation of the organisation and local government more broadly. So it's a bigger picture issue, and that's why having those policy frameworks in place is so important.
I've still got a list of questions, but we're going to run out of time, and I want to come to Catherine and see what's coming through the chat in terms of audience Q&A, because I think we've got probably half an hour to deal with some of those questions. Catherine.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the panellists so far for sharing your views and thoughts on those topics. I've got a question here from Lydia at Whittlesea in regard to Julie's comment about the mandatory training being slightly adjusted for South Gippsland elections based on, I guess, the feedback that came out of the original mandatory training.
Thanks for that question, Lydia. So it was those 4 areas that we focused on. So it was in relation to council decision-making processes, the time requirements for councillors in their role, the role of the integrity agencies, and the interaction protocols with staff. So they were the 4 areas that we improved on. Again, that might need, I don't know whether that will need further improvement. We'll wait and see how it rolls out. The good thing, as you know, we've got a monitor that's about to be appointed to South Gippsland, and we'll be able to get some feedback, I think, through that process as to how if it's been more effective or if we need to still improve on that. The other thing that seems to be coming out is in those initial discussions that PricewaterhouseCoopers are having, the targeted discussions at the moment in the lead into the discussion paper for the cultural project, the local government culture project. There's certainly emerging some discussions around training, so there might be more things that come out of the culture project in those discussions. So look, if there will be an opportunity to feed into or to respond to the discussion paper, and if there are ideas about how we could improve on that, certainly, you know, if you think training is really critical for councillors in terms of culture, then certainly would be really keen to hear from all of you about what might be able to be improved, because that upfront training is so critical. I agree.
Thank you, Julie, for that. And you know, training has come up as an issue in the chat function, and some comments there around, you know, how particularly for a first-term councillor, they can be better informed to understand these responsibilities. The discussion we've heard about, I guess, has ranged from this issue with culture and the breakdown, particularly at that governance level around the council table, and yet and how that though then creates risks of corruption or breaches of the Local Government Act, or even perceived corruption, as David referred to. But yet it still is that issue that we haven't really cracked the nut of. And I know, Julie, this culture review program will go hopefully some way toward that. But in terms of other questions that are coming through, Chris, I think we could probably open up to the floor and as well.
And I think Tony Rownick perhaps might be prepared to make a comment on the mandatory training and how that could be focused differently next time.
Hey, thanks a lot, Chris. Hey, everyone. Yeah, my comment there was to say that the mandatory training was necessarily constrained in that we had to present what was set out in the regulations, and much of that, understandably, was really telling councillors what their legislative obligations were. You know, what was a conflict of interest, what were the rules around conduct of meetings and rules around the difference between the CEO's role and their role. That didn't leave a lot of time to focus on those soft skills that really are about how councillors can be more effective as a group, getting on, dealing with conflict, dealing with the performance review process with the CEO, for example. So I wonder whether it would be useful for councillors to give some of that feedback back to government in terms of, next time around, perhaps involving some of that training around those softer skills. And maybe that would involve utilising people other than, say, lawyers like myself, people who've actually got some real expertise in that space.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of councils have actually rolled out some of their own programs around that, Tony. There's been some really good examples of that. I mean, even the Mayor of Kingston would be able to tell you about what we did at Kingston in terms of building value sets up front with the councillors as part of the induction program. So sorry to drop you in the frame, Steve, but there's also, I know that there are a number of consultants that have been floating around working with councils in those early stages to build that teamwork and those relationships. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that there's definitely that needs to be done. I do remember also VLGA, you rolled out a number of really good forums before the election as well to raise awareness. And I remember being a guest speaker at one of those, talking about, the role of the CEO and what's important. And, so I think there's a sort of a package of a number of things. It's sort of mandatory training plus the peak bodies, I think, that can add some value. And I think that also councils themselves in that induction stage can also add value. But I think what you're talking about is upfront, so then they understand what's expected upfront, not when you actually become a councillor and step in. But yeah, so I think that's part of I think that's why it's coming up in the cultural review. So good point, Tony, thanks.
And Julie, just on that, I think that highlights the role that peak bodies do play in the sector, particularly as we've heard you outline the role of LGV and David, IBAC, and Michael, the local government inspectorate. There is that space there, and that is why the VLGA is in existence as that sort of peak body supporting good governance in the local government sector. The induction programs that we rolled out post the election were tailored to individual councils. So they weren't a sort of Zoom session, every councillor from across the state join in. We really did tailor them because we saw and identified that as something that was critically important to do. And of course, I acknowledge Tony Rannick and Hunt & Hunt lawyers and their assistance. We brought in those technical experts to do that. One of the things the cultural review scope, I guess, doesn't go into a lot of detail about is perhaps some of the systemic challenges that also influence culture. And how do we communicate not only the voters about the role of local government and an elected representative, but also those candidates who are wishing to, step up and take on a significant responsibility. A systemic tension is, for example, the very campaigning process and election process that candidates have to go through to be elected, where they may well, advocate for a single policy issue. But of course, as we know, once elected, that doesn't come into their role as the councillor, where their responsibility extends to governing for all of the stakeholders in the community. So hopefully the cultural review piece will pick up on some of those things and offer some solutions that don't also compromise local democracy, which of course will be very important as well.
Councillor Medica from Mildura, who I think is the Mayor, still the Mayor, Councillor Medica. I'm interested to hear a bit more about your comment about people coming from outside the public sector and, embracing the requirements of local government.
Oh, look, dynamic people working in private industry don't really, and even I've only been on 5 years, and when I got onto council and realised what was behind sorry, let me rephrase that. There's a desire to change council when you get on it. You don't understand what's behind that facade of, you know, I don't want to bin or I want more investment. I really do think after that, those years and years of neoliberalism or deregulation, there's a lack of understanding that if you get your process right and you get your policy right, everything will fall into place. People are more worried about changing things rather than getting things right and working really hard within those parameters that people like you guys set. I'm becoming one of you people, which I think is pretty cool. But that's, to me, within the induction, how do you get that across? Because a lot of new councillors hit the ground, they want to get going, they want to change things immediately. And if you're capable of changing your process and policy really quickly, that's when the problems begin, I reckon. So I was just trying to make that point. I've got a couple of quite close friends who are very dynamic councillors, but they do struggle a little bit with that. Why is there so many barriers put up in front of us? And once again, the other thing too is that as a mayor, trying to articulate your code of conduct or what IBAC do, or sometimes you become the person that is immediately, so, well, why are you stopping me from doing it? Well, no, it's just the rules that you put your hand up, the rules of the game that you put your hand up to play in. And I think that's an interesting thing to explore, particularly with how, you know, we live in a quasi-plutocracy anyway. Sorry, did I just say that? Yes, I did. How do we actually wrap our heads around that idea that money does demand things of us day and night? And just to finish the full articulation, we've been worried and talked about this year that the new Local Government Act is fantastic. It gives us these freedoms, but councillors, other than the mayor, are still voluntary. And there may be a little bit of pushback in that, because at the end of the day, if you're doing 40 hours a week for yourself and 15 or 20 hours a week for council for 23 grand a year, you start to wonder how and where the process fits together. I'm not saying that leads people to challenge the governance rules, but it just exposes people, particularly people with no background in what we've talked about today, and the just want to do it people. Let's get involved with it and make it happen.
That's a good point, Jason, and I think that highlights those tensions that I was referring to before. Steve, Councillor Steve Stakos, you've made a comment in the chat. Did you want to talk to that?
Thank you, and thanks, Julie. Julie was actually our CEO when we developed our values, and funnily enough, we've had a range of difficult decisions. And, you know, for the councillors who are struggling with these decisions, particularly in the context of a very influential former councillor trying to exert influence on the current council, it's just been really great. And I can see by some gestures that this isn't the only council that's suffering from that kind of thing. Just to remind the councillors of the decision-making process that we all agreed to during our initial phase when we were creating the culture that we wanted to continue. For us, it was like, let's put last term's culture away. Let's never look at it again. Let's start again. Let's work with what kind of council do we want to be working in? How do we want to be making decisions? Evidence-based, you know, looking at the advice, looking at the community, etc. And we've been able to navigate decision-making in a way that I think steers away from the old culture of, oh, well, let's just defer the difficult decisions, or let's just make highly political or populist decisions. Let's actually make decisions in the best interests of the community. And it's been so good just having those tools in the kit to pull the councillors back in and to refocus them.
Catherine, there's a bit of activity in the chat there. I know some are comments, but some questions perhaps for our panel before we start to wrap up, because we're running out of time.
There's a question here for Julie about when the Remuneration Tribunal might release their report on councillor allowances, and that's something that's come up in the discussion as well.
Yeah, just for memory, I think that they're going to be providing some advice to the minister later this year, I think, sort of closer to Christmas, I think. I think that's the latest on that. Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but I think it's not too far off. I think they have to do that within, within a certain period of time. I can't remember the details, but yeah, I think it's later this year.
Councillor Emerson, would you like to ask your question?
I haven't got a question. I've just got a reply to the Remuneration Tribunal the state government set in place in June that they had to deliver a decision by, I think it's the 18th of December.
I think it was 6 months.
Yep.
6 months from that date, which brings us to the end of the year. That's what I can exactly remember.
No, there's a date, and I think it's the 18th of December.
Thanks, Murray and Julie. I might just throw in, there's another report that's come out this week, and I think the sector is probably going to respond in some different ways to this, and that's the Victorian Ombudsman's annual report, which has found that local councils are the most complained about public bodies for that period of the Ombudsman's report, largely around complaint handling and communication in relation to complaints. I wonder if the panel cares to comment on how, well, obviously we should take these things seriously, but how much focus should we be putting on this, do you think?
Like we receive a lot of complaints too, but not in the range of what the Ombudsman does. But when you look at the array of services provided by council, it's not surprising that there are complaints. So I'm a ratepayer. There's times when I'm not happy with things that happen in my local government area too. So I think it just has to be put in the context of complaints are, they're serious. They need to be looked at, but that doesn't take into account how many are actually, have been validated and found to be, with substance. So there's a lot of work that goes in there just because you receive, and especially now, everyone can. It's very easy to lodge complaints. It's hard for us as oversight agencies to triage them and look at them and vet them and do things with them. So it's just the numbers might be right, but you always temper that with, what's the ability to actually action them.
We had a forum with the Ombudsman she attended that was set up through LGV just last week, and it was really well attended. We had over 200 people, I think, in attendance at that forum. She talked through her expectations around what a good complaints policy would look like. The one really strong message that came out of that for me was that she was really open to councils tailoring that policy based on resources. So I think it's, again, that's the flexibility of not having it's the benefit of not having a one size fits all, where you can say, if you have less resources, you can tailor that policy based on what resources you do have. So I thought it was a very, very good presentation. And I think that councils really need to think about the way that they develop those up. Take her guidelines. There are very, very clear guidelines around, what a good complaints policy sort of looks like. But there was definitely a recognition of the difference between councils, which I thought was really heartening to hear.
Yeah, just my one observation would be that the headline can often get a little bit of pushback from the sector, and it's a little bit unfair to put all the councils together and then aggregate the numbers and make it the most complained about sector. So. But what I would say is take it as a positive. There's a lot of good material in the report. Often it's an early indicator of potential problems. So even if it's not your council, it's certainly some good data to look at and do a refresh of your own operating environment to see if you've got any improvements or reforms that are needed.
Thanks, David. There's some comments in the chat about CEO performance reviews and the role of independence and the capacity of councillors. I think we'll note those as comments that people can take on board. In the interests of moving this to a logical conclusion now, I'd like to ask each of the panel members to just reflect on where you think individual councils or the sector as a whole should be focusing now as we move out of the first year of the council term.
Well, the race to the end of the year with the implementation of the Local Government Act has to be on the top of my list. And also the contribution towards the culture project is going to be really important. Now that's going to land with all of you later this year, sort of closer to Christmas, but you're going to have plenty of time. We're going to give you until, sort of around February or late into February to be able to respond back. The minister's really keen to hear from the sector around that, so that's really, really critical. So I think they're probably the two key things for us that we would like you to focus on. Obviously, the other thing that seems to be emerging as well is the use of the new tools that are available to you around conduct. for the arbitration process is the use of that arbiter process for misconduct is now starting to take off. So the trend is the greater use of that is an interest, which I expected was going to happen, but certainly we've seen a trend of rising number of those misconduct requests for arbitration. So I think that that's going to be an interesting space going forward to watch. And I think that most importantly for all of you is to have a look at those decisions that are coming out. We load them onto our website, but also the councils must publish them in their council meetings. So keep an eye on some of those decisions that are happening where arbiters are putting their reports that are going into council meetings, because I think there's lots of learnings out of that in terms of what is considered to be misconduct. So
that whole conduct and culture space, I think, will be rich fodder for future panel discussions. Thank you, Julie, for your contribution today. David, Operation Sandon, when are we going to see the outcomes of that?
Yes, we're finalising the reporting in that now. It's been a long journey, and it's because it crosses over many different policy aspects of both state and local government. So it's coming. We're with the period where we put the report out, or excerpts of the report for the natural justice process for those people that are commented about in the report. We're still planning to publish early next year. We're hoping before Christmas. We're just not going to make that timeline, but early in the new year, expect to see that. And it'll be quite a comprehensive report, and we'll have a lot to talk about when that comes out. If I can just say one thing in terms of councils and what the focus should be, for mine, it's strategic, and more strategic. The best operating councils are the ones that have that focus, that are less involved in the day-to-day operations. They play a great governance role for the organisation in terms of the remit of their operations, but they're focused on the strategic. And there's so many big things happening quickly in Victoria, Australia, and around the world that councils really need to be focused on. And a very small example of that is the transition to renewable energy. That's happening quicker than we all expected. Where's your electrical vehicle charging station? Have you got one in your municipality right in your main shopping strip? If you haven't, you probably need one. So there's a really simple one for me.
Great, thank you. Good advice, David. And Michael, your thoughts on focus for the next period?
Something that struck me, it's sort of to David's point about the strategy, and I've had conversations with a number of CEOs and councillors recently around briefing sessions. It gets to the role of it strikes me that there's a misunderstanding on particularly new councillors as to how they can actually make the most of those sessions, how it's not a conflict for them to go in there and ask questions and seek information. It's also for the professional staff of council and the CEO. It's really important that when councillors show up to those meetings, that they document that they go there. So we've seen a lot of friction in council meetings that come from, there was a mixed representation of people who show up to briefings. So some people feel that other people have got an advantage over them because they know more. But it hasn't been a sort of a method of capturing some of this feedback and the participation. And I think it's some of the angst that I've seen in my short time involved in this, it can be dealt with by that relation. Councillors having confidence that they know who to go to, how to do it without interfering with the work of council staff, but to get the information that they need. And I think just having a really solid understanding about how they can do that, and it doesn't all have to happen in a council meeting, and protections can still be preserved through various methods. But I think more work around that, around making the most of the professional staff of council to give you the information you need as councillors to make informed decisions.
That's really interesting, Michael, to have that raised. They are important tools, aren't they, in that whole information gathering process for councillors to make informed decisions. So Thanks for that, and thanks for your contribution today to Michael, to David, and to Julie. I think that's been very insightful, and I hope our audience has gotten something from today's conversation. Catherine, I'm going to hand over to you to wrap up.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, David, Michael, and Julie. That's been a terrific discussion today, and I really do thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. And also to all of you in the audience, thank you very much for your attendance today. It demonstrates your commitment to the local government sector and the various roles that you have, and also the importance of understanding, I guess, what is good governance. And as David said, you know, that's where that strategic focus should really be the goal of all councils and councillors, and particularly in light of the 140 odd services that you or your council delivers. There really is no time, I think, for the council, and it's such a shame that some of these cultural issues are distracting councillors away from those strategic governance matters that they should be focusing on. There was a comment in the chat we didn't get to from Jason up in Mildura about the amount of time for staff supporting councillors, particularly as well, how much more time have they had to spend supporting councillors and dealing with conflict. Some of those issues we heard at the beginning of the discussion resulting from the COVID environment, remote working environment. But then, as David said, he's not seeing this first year of the council term that differently from others, although acknowledging some of the complexities of COVID. So I think the cultural review process that is underway at the moment and the results of that will be very important for the sector. There's a lot to contemplate, I think, with that, in addition to those three inquiries that are happening at the moment in IBAC. We've talked about the social media, Operation Watts, and also Operation Sandon, and I imagine the outcomes of those will also feed into somewhere the cultural review project as well, or at least we hope that they do, so that the sector gets some of that consistency of guidance material that it's seeking. Anyway, that's probably enough for me, but I did want to just highlight that the VLGA's annual general meeting is being held on the 18th of November, and I'm very pleased to announce that as our keynote speaker, we have Peggy O'Neill, focusing on governance and leadership and why culture matters. So exactly what we've been talking about today, and Peggy can talk particularly in the context of her role as president of the Richmond Football Club, how she's transformed, I guess, the governance of that particular organisation to make it a high-performing team, although those of you who don't follow Richmond might have a different view of that. But anyway, look, Deborah will also share the registration link for the AGM, so please register, and we look forward to welcoming you there. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Catherine. The link is in the chat for anyone who wants to follow up on that. Just a couple of other very quick plugs. VLGA Connect, the governance update, will be dropping in about half an hour with some discussion on a whole range of things that have happened this past week. If you're not familiar with it, it's on YouTube and podcast, a couple of episodes a week, as well as the local government news roundup, which aims to keep you up to date with news from around the sector, not just in Victoria, but more broadly as well. The recording of this will be made available to all registrants as soon as it's ready, probably early next week. That just leaves me to thank you all for your contributions today. This is the last live panel for the year. If you've been on a few of them, thank you. We've covered some really interesting topics, and we're looking forward to doing it again in the new year. Have a great long weekend, everyone, and we'll see you around. Bye for now.